Nythamar, please, without further ado, just feel free for your talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Sinara. This was a beautiful presentation. Let me thank Gabriel Mograbi and the organizing committee for putting together this wonderful event. I'll just try to share a few slides with you guys, reflecting this ongoing research, and then we can see if we have some questions. Let's see if this is going to work. Can you guys see it from the beginning? All right. So yes, the idea here is to revisit the neuroethics of free will and cognitive enhancement. This is part of an ongoing research program. I started in doing a research in critical theory and political philosophy, and then I moved on to investigate decision-making process in neurophilosophy. So there has been a few publications regarding this program. Basically, the idea is to strike a balance between what would be considered to be normativist models of normativity, especially in normative ethics, and let's say hardcore naturalism or reductionist conceptions of naturalism. And I'm trying to propose some kind of mitigated constructivism or constructionism that would meet halfway between the more extreme positions. This has been conducted together with several colleagues and students at the Brain Institute at Porto Alegre. We also have included some research in AI ethics recently relating to the use of neural networks. And basically, the idea here is to investigate how neurobiological evolution can benefit from experiments involving sociality or so-called social cultural evolution in order to offer some different interpretations of classic themes such as free will, agency, and moral responsibility. In different moments of our research, we're doing more classical problems in bioethics as they would be revisited in neuroethics. We had a couple of publications, and now more recently, we are moving towards the usage of artificial intelligence and new technologies for different ways of measuring social cognition in different experiments and projects. Basically, we are assuming or starting from the founding women of neuroethics, Patricia Churchland, Adina Roskis, and Martha Faraz, in their respective contributions. In our case, we're very much related to Pat Churchland's major contributions to neurophilosophy. But we also did some work on Savulescu's and Persons Unfit for the Future, where we did some work on moral enhancement. Basically, it's the idea of considering these resorting to moral enhancement, given the difficulty of contemplating concrete solutions coming from politics in terms of geopolitical confrontations, and not only in terms of the threatening world peace and world order, but also in terms of the environment, especially in terms of environmental threats. So the idea here is that given that we don't have too much hope in terms of moral psychology or even human moral ecology, we end up resorting to this idea, this possibility of altering human biology in order to meet the ethical demands of modern world, in the words of Professor Savulescu. So the idea here, of course, is also calling into question the way we deal with moral progress overall, and also the way we have epistemological approaches to this problem of normative theories in ethics. So the idea of a moral epistemology itself has to be also re-examined precisely from a naturalized understanding of a social epistemology, according to which you have also non-cognitivist elements that contribute to our understanding of social cognition. So we were basically trying to deal with both normative ethical theories and different formulations in social and political philosophy. So I'll be confining myself more to the normative thrust of these problems, which started, as I mentioned, in terms of decision-making process. We are considering the way Facebook users would respond to different scenarios, online and offline, by resorting to fMRI conducted on subjects. We had something like 900 subjects that took a survey, and then these came down to something like narrowed down to 70 or 80 students of different fields in the university. And we came up with different conclusions regarding their response to these different experiments. They were basically variants of some experiments already quite known. For instance, in Joshua Green's handling of the moral dilemmas and so-called trolley problem, where you have a scenario in which you have more like a utilitarian response. For instance, in the switch dilemma, where it makes some sense to sacrifice one life in order to save 5 lives. And then you have a different situation where a lot of people would be hesitating to push this obese person off the footbridge in order to save 5 lives. So even though the calculation, the calculus is about the same, in the second scenario, you have something more of a deontological or more personal involvement of the participant in the experiment, insofar as the idea of a humanity, for instance, as expressed in the categorical imperative, is also taken into account. Now, the problem here of relating these different intuitions, like moral intuitions, moral beliefs, moral judgments, they all have been examined in this vast field of meta-ethics, which by the end of the 20th century became so broad as to comprise not only the original questions of critique of intuitionism or emotivist, expressivist, alternative readings of moral problems in the beginning of the 20th century, but also hybrid models, as we have today, trying to combine both cognitivist and non-cognitivist approaches to these very problems. So basically what you're doing in neuroethics is combining some of these classic problems with more recent findings in neuroscience, especially when they relate to questions of selfhood, of moral choice, freedom of the will, agency, and so forth. So that's how we're gonna situate the use of smart drugs and biotechnological device, including neuropharmacos, in order to do something like cognitive enhancement, not only in terms of therapy, but also for enhancing cognition as such. So in this sense, we have been making possible this recasting of different conceptions. They're already there, for instance, in biomedical ethics, or the more traditional formulations of bioethics, when we think of principles such as autonomy, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, and making them understood in more classical terms. We can do about the same when we are revisiting the freedom of the will. For instance, as we go back to the debate opposing Erasmus and Luther in the 16th century, we can think that Erasmus came up with this little treatise on the freedom of the will, the Libero Arbitrio, written in Latin. And then Luther, his opponent as a reformer, as you know, came up with a different polemical title on the bondage of the will, the Servo Arbitrio. In the next centuries, we think especially of Spinoza in the 17th century and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. As Sinara mentioned, Hobbes, we can think of many other authors. They revisited this very problem. I believe that Spinoza had a very good grasp of the Erasmus-Luther debate, because he was living in the Netherlands in a time when Calvinists and Arminians had many disputes over predestination and this idea of human choice vis-a-vis their conversion. But the same thing must be said of Immanuel Kant, whom, according to many historians of modern philosophy, believe that Kant was precisely trying to avoid this conundrum opposing God's sovereignty to humans' agency or moral freedom, precisely because human beings had been created in God's image and likeness. And it's very much the case that Kant was so careful to make a distinction between human choice, he used the word Willkür, as opposed to human freedom, Freiheit,
Nythamar,
which is only used for this very pure, transcendental, a priori understanding of reason.
Professor Nythamar, do you hear us?
Right.
We
Yes.
we don't see your slides are not changing.
Or they are no
I think
longer
you have
changing?
the same problem as Professor Sinara.
Or from the very beginning?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Okay, so
I
can we
was,
try? Can you stop sharing and start sharing again?
yeah, that's what I just did. Is it back?
Okay,
No.
now it's it's determinism versus free will. Yes.
But is it changing at all?
Try to change it, please.
No, it's not changing.
No.
Is it changing?
Yes, now it is, yes.
Is it changing?
Yes. Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so I just mentioned the Erasmus-Luther free will debate and how Spinoza and Kant tried to offer a solution in terms of compatibilism by making compatible this idea of determinism. As you all know, in Kant's time, we had the Laplacian hypothesis of a full determinism. It's very much like Spinoza thought about it. But then we can also recapitulate that this very idea was stemming from the times of Plato himself, as we think of Plato's metaphysics of the soul in his tripartite conception of a psyche or psyche, wherever you want to pronounce the Greek word for soul or anima in Latin, with a rational faculty, a sensible faculty, and an affective faculty, very much like the New Testament or Judeo-Christian conceptions of the soul would have it in 3 parts of the soul. Basically, the idea is that you'd have a substantialist understanding. So the major, let's say, conclusion that we have reached at the end of all these massive criticisms of Cartesian dualism, starting with Gilbert Ryle's work on the conception of the mind, is precisely that we no longer resort to something like a substance or an essentialist understanding of a true substance, one immaterial called the mind, and the other one material or bodily called matter or the body itself. So the idea here is that in my presentation in June, I was trying to see how this conception of a selfhood, subjectivity, self-awareness, and consciousness, combined with this idea of freedom, could allow for a mitigated conception of compatibilism, precisely because we no longer can stick to a hardcore determinism, but we have today something like probabilistic determinism. Some people will say that this is more like talking about causation in terms of probability, very much so. So this was the conclusion we reached in our first event in June. And the idea then to recast the ethical moral sense of human responsibility by calling into question pre-modern metaphysical and libertarian conceptions of a free will makes a lot of sense, precisely because we are taking into account the sociality of the brain. So both Damasio and Prince favor such a reformulation of Spinoza compatibilism as emotion, feeling, and biological regulation play a role in human reason in hybrid terms, both cognitive and non-cognitive, embodied, embedded, extensive, and active and affective, avoiding thus the absolutist and reductionist claims associated with both normativism and naturalism. So the idea here is precisely to move away from classical determinism, to move away from substantialist, essentialist conceptions of a free will, and reach this mitigated conception of compatibilism, as I mentioned. We can thus revisit cognitive and functionalist conceptions of empathy, compassion, and social emotions, rethinking them as highly flexible and context-dependent responses to different environments through networks of varieties of basic homeostasis. This was Damasio's contribution, in social cultural homeostasis, created and guided by a reflective conscious minds, collective selves that individuate through a unique social practice, leading to social cooperation and the evolution of social norms. So the idea here is that I'm also resorting to the idea of narratives, to accounts that are traded down from one generation to another in terms of traditions. Basically, this is the idea of a cultural heritage that we have even among tribes, clans, families, but also nations and collective social groups overall. Therefore, human beings are capable of social cooperation, empathy, and revising their social norms and moral judgments, but they alone cannot explain the normative impulse of a normal agency or its responsibility. I mentioned Yitzhak Melamed's very interesting conclusion that Spinoza's view of the free will is precisely that we have this innate false belief. It's almost like an intuition we most of us share as a common sense conception of a free will. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that there is such a thing as a free will. So it's very much like a Moore's paradox. It's raining, but I don't believe so, right? Necessitarianism is true, but I do not believe it. In Melamed's terms, there is objectively no free will, but we still believe it. So it's understandable that people resort to the belief in free will. This was Spinoza's wage. So in Damasio's reading of Spinoza, it's precisely that freedom is something used in free will, but also for decision-making process that involve many other variables, including imagination, previous past experience, and so forth, as Sinara also mentioned in her criticism of Libet experiments. So we have also to do this challenging in terms of the normative theories. As I said, we have both a critique of reductionist understandings of some of these naturalist theories, but we also have this criticism being raised against traditional understanding of normative theories. So the idea here is we follow Pat Churchland, is that many pressing moral problems of our time are problems about how best to regulate certain practice, organizations, and institutions, how best to solve problems at the global rather than the local level, how best to achieve sustainability. What regulations should govern drugs such as marijuana, cocaine, and heroin? How much religious tolerance is too much? For any of these matters, knowledge is always preferable to ignorance, whom to trust in the knowledge domain. This is very, very relevant today in times of obscurantism, as we see this surge of a fundamentalism, both in northern and southern hemispheres. The method of reflective equilibrium, in my case, has been used here as a coherence account of justification. So I'm resorting to this wide reflective equilibrium as a way of revisiting our beliefs, intuitions, and judgments in moral normative issues, very much like Rawls proposed it by resorting to Nelson Goodman's metaphor. And the idea here is that belief can always be used even after get your problems become part of this difficult composition of knowledge as justified through belief plus something else, because we can always think of free will in terms of beliefs as much as people have different moral, religious, and ideological beliefs. So the idea is basically to revisit this in terms of caring, recognition of others, problem solving, and learning social practice as proposed by Patricia Churchland, precisely because the social brain hypothesis is what guides this way of revisiting the critique of moral intuitions, because in more recent attempts to rehabilitate intuitions, usually people, if they want to resort to more, they will go back to Plato or to classical intuitionism, and it's always the problem of taking for granted that you have some conceptions, or in epistemological terms, basic beliefs, in order to come up with some theory of normativity. And we see that this is a dead-end procedure, precisely because we can always call into question foundationalism in moral theory. So we are resorting to this idea of the social brain in such a way that allows for us to revisit the conception of beliefs or intuitions very much in the way people are today resorting to these very beliefs. We can see very much the way people still talk about being more committed to one or another way of approaching moral issues or religiosity or spirituality. And this is very much the way in social neuroscience we would approach this problem, very much like Patricia Churchland and Antonio Damasio proposed, as we recast the neuroethics of free will in terms of combining this traditional understanding of normative ethics with neuroethics. So that's how we can see also that metaethics ends up being very much used in hybrid terms to serve or to attend to some of the most intriguing counterintuitive results of neuroscientific experiments. So the idea that we could justify cosmetic pharmacological interventions, neurointerventions, does not depend on being committed to some conservative, libertarian, or liberal understanding of cognitive enhancement, precisely because you can have different ways of justifying in one way or another. So we are very much avoiding making such a claim, but we prefer to keep this idea of a wide reflective equilibrium so as to revisit these very intuitions and moral beliefs. Hence, personhood, moral agency, and free will turn out to emerge as social construals within justificatory narratives. So the problem here is that you can have different ways of making one, not only in terms of epistemological justification, we can also have a social political justification, as Patricia Churchland made the case for this in terms of regulating resort to certain technologies or use of drugs that might be evoked when dealing with biotechnologies and new technologies to enhance the human condition without resorting to normativist and naturalist foundational principles. I had one article has already been published. I shared on the chat precisely with these unconclusive notes saying that we can see that in a more liberal approach, we see no much of a problem in terms of a cognitive enhancement, and we are very much sympathetic to Savulescu and Person's proposal in their book, Unfit for the Future. But we can understand also the worries in terms of addiction and side effects, not to mention in terms of social justice or access to these technologies, especially thinking in terms of a public health system. And we very much try to keep these things open, especially when you see that, for instance, the whole discussion about consciousness. If you go in by taking sides with Searle or Dennett, you can, of course, have different ways of talking about selfhood. In our understanding, it's very easy to conclude that essentially substantialist understanding of the soul would entail also a refusal of any essentialist or substantialist conception of consciousness. So at the end of the day, we stay with this call for social normativity in order to make a case for better justified positions in terms of a cognitive enhancement. And therefore, our mitigated transformative conceptions of naturalism and normativity seem to be more defensible than more radical extreme positions. So I'm going to stop here and allow for Q&A and for a discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nythamar. Questions? Please, Renato.
Thank you very much, Professor Nythamar, for your talk. My question is for you. And thank you, Professor Sinara, as well, of course, for your talk. But my question here is for Professor Nythamar. You mentioned in passing very, very rapidly, Unfit for the Future. And I think this is a fascinating book. This is a fascinating discussion. And I'd like to know a little bit more about your take on moral enhancement. Okay, and I'd like to know your what does your view on enhancement entail on this question of moral and not only cognitive? I mean, it's cognitive moral enhancement or it's just moral enhancement. I'd like to hear you on this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. And of course, I was trying to avoid making a case for a more liberal or more conservative approach, because I can see the worries and the limitations of the arguments coming from both sides, right? But I myself, I tend to be very liberal, and I don't think it will be a problem or anything that will be threatening human dignity or the political pluralism that we assume that must be cultivated in our liberal democracies, meaning that, of course, people who hold more conservative religious views, they're allowed to do so. It's not very different from abortion, euthanasia, and other hard cases in bioethics, right? So I would say that some of these experiments could be welcome, even in terms of a cosmetic neurotechnologies, as mentioned, Adderall or Ritalin, not only for therapeutic usage, but if we think also in terms of oxytocin and neurotransmitters that could be in a Paul-Zach's proposal, for instance, molecules that would incentivize a more cooperative behavior on the part of subjects, seems to be very desirable. But of course, I understand that there is always this problem, which seems to be very much related to the very hard question of this conference, which is free will. People think that they would be threatened by something they are conditioning them by taking a pill or something that will make them go in one direction or another. But this happens all the time. Every time you take any drug or every time you eat anything, or in different ways, we are always being conditioned in one way or another. So my idea of free will is precisely that we can stick to this common sense belief of free will, as Professor Adina Roski is making a case for, or most of us would accept that we can talk about free will. But very much like Spinoza said, even if there is no such a thing, it's understandable that we want to believe that we are free to go in one direction or another. And therefore, I think that AI, artificial intelligence, is offering today also many possibilities in terms of this cognitive enhancement that's not only therapeutic, it's also very much in terms of enhancing cognition. And I don't see any problems with this as long as we take the necessary measures. For instance, when we have this problem of scarcity of resources, we know that this is already happening today. When we think of Ritalin or Adderall, how many poor people in Brazil do have access to some of these medication? Of course, the public health system is supposed to be, providing medication for people who have, attention deficit, these different sorts of disorders in this large spectrum, like many others disorders that could produce some disabilities or difficulties in terms of learning for kids. Among our researchers at the Brain Institute at Porto Alegre, several of our colleagues working with people in the favelas of Porto Alegre, with very poor population, precisely by administering these Ritalin medication and conducting work in different problems, not only in terms of the spectrum of attention deficit, hyperactivity, but also in terms of dyslexia and autism and different neuropharmacos that are produced at the Brain Institute at Porto Alegre. So I would say that, yes, it's possible to have regulation, even in terms of public policy making. And of course, this is a big debate in any democracy, as much as it is with abortion and other kinds of legislation. Thank you.
Are you hearing us? So, I mean, there's any other questions from the
we have a question here in the chat. Okay.
You can read it.
Okay, so I'll translate on the spot here. Okay, Thomas raised his hand. Thomas, if you can try, we're not hearing you.
Oh, well, I thought you were going to read.
Now we hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you were going to read the question from the chat. That's fine.
No, please, you have precedence. You asked first.
Precedence, I don't have any precedence. You guys are all amazing. So this is a question that it's an attempt to bridge the two very nice talks that I just heard. So this is a question maybe for both of you. And so here's a standard way that the debate about free will and neuroscience plays out. And I've heard this play out a number of times at many conferences over the years. And so the neuroscientist adopts a version of free will that they think they're taking from what most people believe. And they think that version is libertarian, agent causationist, dualistic, etc. And they say, look, the stuff that we're doing shows that the brain is mechanistic and thoughts and ideas are reducible in a certain way. And so we don't have that, we don't have free will. And then the philosopher comes and says, but look, here's compatibilism. And this thing is totally consistent. And you could be Hobbes or anybody else, And so now I explain, the neuroscientist tried to explain away free will, and then the philosopher tries to explain away the explaining away, and does it with a different conception of free will. So it's a weird shell game that gets played, because what you weren't doing was having a shared understanding of what free will is, and then saying whether we have it or we don't have it, or whether that thing is or isn't consistent with the neuroscientific literature or the literature from other fields. So that's the first thing. That's for Professor Nara on your end, and then it connects to something that Nythamar said, which is something I think about a lot, which is, so then you have a choice about whether, if you think we don't have what lots of people think we have, so you think, like Al Mealy calls it, like what does he call it? Like extreme. It's like the super extreme gas, like the super high price gas, as opposed to like low gasoline, right? High profile gasoline. And we don't have that. And so you have a choice. You can keep calling it free will, but you just mean this other thing. So you can revise the concept so that it fits all this stuff that you were talking, the neuroscience. It helps on Nythamar's project on the end of the neuroethics. So like revising it helps, but like you could also just want to eliminate it also and replace it. I mean, I take it this is actually Churchland's move is more an eliminationist, not a revisionist strategy. And so I'm like, maybe that's another thing. I guess I was trying to think that's a thread that runs through both of your talks, because you get a nice picture of it from the first talk, the second talk, of this like waxing from the like libertarian agent causationist stuff through the filter of neuroscience to this kind of compatibilistic stuff at the level of theory. And then what you're doing there was even more like, now we're looking at how this plays out like in the sort of street, in the doctor's office, in the schoolrooms. And so I just wonder, maybe that part of it, the debate too, we should have about revisionism, eliminativism, this is a perfect place to have that too. And your talks like together were just, I thought, fertile for that question. But sorry, that was way longer than I meant for it to be. But I love the talks. It was awesome. So thanks.
I'll ask you to answer the questions. I mean, briefly, because
sorry,
we already extrapolated the time of the session. But feel free to respond, of course.
Very quick then, Thomas, thank you very much for your question. Yes, I think that the first thing that we have to establish is that neuroscientists and philosophers, they have to work together. Yeah, there is this big problem that you say that, they say, oh, there is no free will. But what I think, Thomas, and what I try to show here is that even these things that they say, oh no, free will doesn't exist. Free will is an illusion. This can be questioned not only from the philosophical point of view, but also from the experiments that some neuroscientists are bringing, to prove the idea that free will doesn't exist. I think that it's possible to do this. It's important to increase the dialogue, but at the same time, it's very important to see that maybe there is some problems with the interpretations of the experiments, that they are being brought from us to us from the neuroscientists. And philosophers, you're completely right, have an important saying on this. And the second question I leave to Professor Nythamar.
But seriously, thank you. Thank you. The talk was great. It was great. So thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Your questions, your comments were brilliant. I really think that this is very much, in a nutshell, what's going on in terms of discussion, to which you have, of course, so much contributed with your own insights and seminal contributions. Yeah, if I had to pick one of these, Thomas, I would say, I would pick revisionism, because I'm avoiding eliminativism, and this is in all great respect and admiration that I have for the Churchlands, for the couple. I think that their contribution is outstanding. I think it's very important for the very work we are doing here at Porto Alegre. But I'm afraid that because of my attempt to keep this first personal phenomenological stance, safe, I have to stick with revisionism. So I would say that this would be my liberal take on the Churchlands. So I think that their contribution makes a lot of sense, except that I think that when we use our, in a common sense, ordinary language, we do talk about propositional attitudes. And of course, both Patricia and Paul agree that in everyday life, we act as if we all, believed in, folk psychology or something like that. But again, I think it was a very good point you raised. And I think this is the very much, where we should focus in terms of our discussions. Thank you very much.
We're going to be back here 5:05 to have the 30 minutes for the coffee break. So thank you, Nythamar. Thank you, Sinara. Thank you, Thomas. Thank everyone in the audience. We'll be back 5:05.